Originally released in September of 1998 as a pocket camera in Japan, the Game Boy Camera was the first camera accessory released for mainstream gaming hardware. In 1999, the Guinness Book of World Records authenticated it as the world's smallest digital camera. Picture quality, however, was not really its strong suit. The camera was limited to taking small pictures and only had Game Boy's 4 shades of gray to work with as far as the palette goes. It sort of begs the question, why would anyone want a camera that takes tiny pictures with only 4 colors and onto a device that can only store about 30 pictures to begin with? We're about to find out. This is the story of Nintendo's Game Boy Camera.
When it's least expected, you're elected, you're the star today. Smile, you're on Game Boy Camera. It's fun to look at yourself as other people do. How's your sense of humor? There's a rumor, laughter's on its way. Smile, you're on Game Boy Camera.
Yes, with Game Boy Camera, you can turn photography into photography.
Smile, you're on Game Boy Camera.
The Game Boy Camera was created by Masato Kuwahara of Nintendo's Research and Development Lab 1. Initially, Nintendo didn't think too much of Kuwahara's project, and the Game Boy Camera was largely dismissed by Nintendo's brass. But Kuwahara was smart and undeterred. Kuwahara approached Creatures Inc. and Hirokazu Tanaka about developing software for the camera. Recruiting these two parties was a stroke of genius. Tanaka has his own incredible story as a composer for Metroid, Kid Icarus, and a slew of other games. He also helped in designing and coding the Famicom and Game Boy audio hardware, along with co-designing the NES Zapper. Creatures Inc. was a Japanese developer who had a strong relationship with Nintendo, having already worked on a myriad of Nintendo games. In fact, they continue to develop games for Nintendo to this day, perhaps most famously known for a number of Nintendo DS Pokemon titles. Kuwahara approached Nintendo about the Game Boy Camera again, but this time he had the backing of a respected and reliable developer, as well as a man that they trusted to help design one of the most iconic pieces of Nintendo hardware in the Zapper. This time, Nintendo said yes. The Game Boy Camera retailed for $49.95, which would be about $74 today. It's an elongated cartridge with a rotatable camera on top. Despite being released in 1998, it's compatible with all of the Game Boy versions with the exception of the Game Boy Micro. Using the original Game Boy's palette, the Game Boy Camera took pictures at a resolution of 160 by 144. Users could make photo albums, slideshows, and put stamps and custom animations over photos, sort of like a rudimentary Snapchat. The Game Boy Camera came in 5 different colors: blue, green, red, yellow, and clear purple, although that was a Japan exclusive. There was also a limited edition gold The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time camera, which contained exclusive Zelda-related stamps to place over pictures. For an additional $59.95, you could purchase the Game Boy Printer. That's right, an accessory for your accessory. The Game Boy Printer connected to the Game Boy via a supplied Universal Game Link cable. The Game Boy Printer can also be connected to a Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance SP, or a Nintendo GameCube Game Boy player. The Game Boy Printer would print your pictures onto custom thermal paper with an adhesive backing, essentially turning your Game Boy Camera pictures into stickers. Regular thermal paper, like the kind used for point-of-sale terminals, can be cut to the proper width and used successfully with the Game Boy Printer as well. The Game Boy Camera included various mini-games, and although these were Game Boy Camera-specific games, the only thing that you really used the camera for was to replace a character's face with a picture of yours. The first game is Space Fever 2, a sequel to Nintendo's Space Invaders arcade knockoff. It served as sort of a hub for the mini-games. At the beginning of the game, you fire on one of 3 enemies, each representing a different mini-game. If you don't fire on any, you'll just begin playing Space Fever 2. With each shot, you alternate between 1 and 2 bullets. One hit results in game over. Thankfully, the game is not very difficult. There are 3 rounds to the main game, each one ending with a giant-headed boss. The third and final boss will be the game phase you chose to insert earlier. Next, we have Ball. Ball is probably the simplest of all of the games. You just need to juggle the 3 balls and prevent any of them from hitting the ground. That's it. And here we have DJ. This game will use whatever picture you chose earlier to represent the DJ. In a sense, you become the DJ. You could actually make songs and recordings in this mini game, but there was really no way to transfer them afterwards. And finally, there's Run, Run, Run. This is a bonus minigame that can only be unlocked by reaching a score of 2,000 or more in Space Fever 2. The game face is attached to a cartoon body, and the player races against a mole and a bird for the finish line. This is probably the most challenging of all of the minigames included, but frankly, this one really isn't difficult either. The Game Boy Camera also came with a few strange Easter eggs. If a user selects the run option on one of the menu screens, the game will sometimes freeze and a disturbing image with the text, "Who are you running from?" or "Don't be so silly" will appear. Strange images would also pop up during system errors. The US version of the Game Boy Camera had 3 such faces, while the Japanese version had a total of 5 faces, with 2 additional faces different from those in the American version. The Japanese version's text read, "How weak," and "Let me be alone." There were other less frightening Easter eggs included. If the user pressed the B button during the credits, a dancing Shigeru Miyamoto would appear. On the title screen, pressing the up button on the D-pad will make Mario dance faster, and pressing the down button on the D-pad will make him dance slower. And finally, while taking a picture, if any button on the D-pad is pressed rapidly, the color palette will flip, causing white to become black and vice versa on the monochrome screen. Sales figures for the Game Boy Camera aren't available, but it's widely believed that it wasn't a big seller as there really wasn't a market for such a niche product at the time. In fact, you can still find Game Boy cameras for sale online at relatively inexpensive prices. Compared to some of its other products, Nintendo put very little into its marketing. Not many reviewers even covered it at the time. Nintendo Power was one of the few to rate it, and of the reviewers that did cover it, it received an average of 83% according to Game Rankings. The Game Boy Camera did manage to gain a bit of notoriety in 2000 when it was used to take the photograph for the album cover of Neil Young's Silver and Gold. But as you can imagine, there weren't exactly a lot of cross-brand customers between Nintendo's young fanbase and a then 54-year-old Neil Young. The Game Boy Camera, printer, and its custom printer paper were discontinued in 2003. In recent years, a few third-party accessories have been released for the Game Boy Camera. In 2010, Mad Catz began selling a kit that allows users to connect the Game Boy to a PC and print images using the PC's printer. And in 2015, Game Boy Photo, a device that allows you to transfer Game Boy Camera's pictures to an SD card, was released by BitBoy. For sales aside, calling Masato Kuwahara's Game Boy Camera a failure would be a mistake. Nintendo may have been right to be wary about bringing the Game Boy Camera to the market at the time, but they were wrong to dismiss the idea altogether. Kuwahara's naysayers may have won the battle, but Kuwahara got the last laugh when in 2009 the DSi launched with 2 integrated digital cameras. 2 years later, the 3DS would expand to include 2 front-facing cameras that could take 3D pictures and a 2D user-facing camera as well. Kuwahara's Game Boy Camera was so far ahead of its time that it even predated cell phone cameras by 4 years. The legacy of the Game Boy Camera isn't to be forgotten about as some low-quality novelty from the 1990s. Its legacy continues to this day, and you can see it anytime you want. Right here. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please let me know in the comments. And hey, while you're at it, why don't you subscribe?